Sophie Turner. Iwan, Rheon. Faye, Marsay. Hempstead, Wright. And finally, Kristian, Nairn. I'd like to start with the elephant in the room. It's been announced that next season will only be 7 episodes and will not air until the summer. So I guess my first question to David and Dan is, why do you hate us all so much? It seems personal.
Well, you know, I guess as Sophie said in that clip, winter is here, and we got to shoot in places where there are trees, and we got to wait for the leaves to fall off. So we're actually waiting to shoot later in the year, and that means we don't finish shooting till February. There's no way to finish post. There's no way to get the show out there until summer. So.
That doesn't account for the 3 Sundays where I will have nothing to do at night. Can you walk me through that in front of 7,000 people and millions of people who are watching?
And rewatch. Start over at the beginning.
That's a good answer. So, there's a plethora of human history to draw from, but is there any civilization or time period specifically that you guys draw the most amount of inspiration in terms of like quest for power, or even any kind of like Machiavellian real life characters throughout history that you can think of specifically?
Well, I think the books are sort of built on a skeleton of medieval Western history, but one of the great things about fantasy is that you're not bound to what happened. So George, when he wrote his books, got to pick all the bits that he liked the most, and he got to skip the so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so part of history. You got to kind of paper over that. And he drew on Mongols, he drew on Native Americans, he drew on everything. He was very deeply read in world history, and you know, and we get to do the same thing. I mean, that's one of the real joys. We're kind of both history buffs, and we get to
recounting the violence of humanity.
Yeah, we get to just look at every awful thing that's happened in the world, not just one part of the world, and we just cram it all into 10 hours, 7 hours rather, a season.
I just want to point out that Sophie Turner made us all do shots of vodka before we came out here. So
I'm 20. I didn't do any of that.
So our answers might not be as articulate as we should.
Okay, good.
Just trying to keep it complete sentences. If I can do a complete sentence, I know I'm in English.
Well, one of the things you guys just touched on was that that obviously you're drawing from source material, but season 6 was the first in which you would pass the books. So obviously next season will continue to do that. Can you talk a little bit about that process and working with George to achieve how much of it is his vision versus how much of it that you guys want to do the show?
Yeah, well, some of it is still, it's still ultimately George's imagination that gave us these characters, that gave us this world. And 3 or 4 years ago, we were in Santa Fe talking to George, and he told us about where he was heading with the books, and that's when he told us the Hodor fate and where the name Hodor came from. And I just remember looking at Dan, it's George's fault. And I remember looking at Dan, and we were both so amazed and excited because it was so freaking cool. And one of the things that's brilliant about it is that this name, which has become almost a joke, people make jokes about Hodor, and then ultimately you realize where that name comes from, and it's suddenly a tragic turn, and that's so George R.R. Martin. So, hopefully we're still living out the spirit of George's imagination, and even though we're beyond the books, I think one thing that's fun is that George's books will be very different in some respects and the same in others, and I think hopefully both the series and the books will be surprising to people who are reading or watching or whatever it is. So, Sophie Turner, her fault.
Sorry.
Well, I'm glad you brought something up because obviously, sadly, we lost one of the most beloved characters of the season and in all of television.
I know. It's
Cancel.
tragic,
Iwan, how did you create such a lovable scamp? And what is it like to be America's sweetheart?
Sorry, what was that?
Like such a lovable scamp.
Thank you, Sophie. I don't know. I mean, I think the key was that when we were discussing the character before we started shooting, that he had this kind of joy in everything that he does. So he's enjoying. He's on the best time of his life, and he loves doing all this stuff. And that, I think, it kind of made him funny. He's not just some psychopath. That's just One Direction. It's got a bit more about him. He's not in One Direction.
Well, as an actor, obviously, you have to find something you love about the character that you're playing, or at least understand where he or she is coming from. So, where is Ramsay Bolton coming from?
I think, poor guy's had a tough upbringing, he's a bastard in the north, which is always difficult. And, he's just looking for his father's love and acceptance and recognition all his life, and, it's kind of, that's obviously, everyone can relate to that. And apart from that, there's very, very little to like about him, I think.
When obviously we lost Hodor.
Thank you, guys.
Kristian, can you talk a little bit about the fan response and what that was like? I'm sure it must have been overwhelming.
Well, yeah, it has been overwhelming. I did not expect it to be so crazy. I'm really, really flattered as well. It's blown my mind. I was in LA a few days ago in a hotel, and all their doorsteps said Hodor on them. I'm going, really? But yeah, it's been incredible. I didn't expect it. I mean, the scene was incredibly written and directed, and I knew it was going to be cool, but I didn't expect the outpouring of emotion. You're gonna make me cry.
All right, let's see if we can make him cry.
Well, I apologize for that. I apologize for making you cry. But the crying in a good way, at least. Well, I've done my job now.
I'd like to do what the show is consistently doing, which is to transition from the sweet into blood. The episodes Battle of Bastards and The Winds of Winter are probably the two most astonishing episodes, not only of this show, but maybe any show ever. And obviously a lot of that has to do with the director, Miguel Sapochnik. Speaking of the battle itself, obviously we could have a whole panel probably about these two episodes, but we have to limit it to a few questions. But speaking of the battle itself, I read that originally it was based on the Battle of Agincourt, which took place between the French and the English in 1415, but as needs changed, this is your quote, as did budgets, it became more like the Battle of Cannae between the Romans and Hannibal in 216. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant by that? What changed and how you changed it?
Originally when we talked about it, the whole idea was to steep it in history. So they wanted a strategic, pitched battle. And so the Battle of Agincourt was, I believe it was the French and the English, wasn't it? French and the English fought it out on a field, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I might screw this up completely, the English attacked and the French encircled them and caught them in a pincer movement, a double envelopment, and once they had them in pincer movement, they basically used archers to mow these people down. And originally we were going to have a lot of horses, like 7 horses deep, and they were going to charge the horses and then actually surround the Allied troops and crush them with the horses. But the problem is, if you run horses at people, they don't like it. Like the first time they're alright, but the second time they're like, I don't really want to run at these people. And the third time they're like, I'm not going. So,
I'm guessing the people don't like it either.
well, sometimes. So the decision is that we weren't going to run horses at people, but instead we were going to run people at people. And then there was this other idea, which I always loved, and was probably the first image that I imagined in my mind when I saw when I read the outline, which was this pile of bodies. And this was something Dave and Dan were really keen on, and something that actually we had a lot of kind of back and forth, because initially it felt like, where does this pile of bodies come from? And then the more research you did, you started realizing when everybody dies, they become a pile of bodies. And gradually this pile of bodies really gets in the way of you achieving anything on a battlefield. And in fact, in the Battle of, is it Cannae? Cannae. The Battle of Cannae, what was happening is these heavily armoured knights were going down into battle, and they were getting stuck between piles of bodies, of dead bodies, and they were becoming sitting ducks to then be picked off, which seemed horrible and a complete bummer to go out to battle and then get your foot stuck somewhere and get picked off. So that seemed like a good way to approach the battle, which is what we did.
And in terms of budget constraints, did that have something to do with it, or was it just?
The not using horses that definitely was a budget constraint. I think any time you do something this big, you always start with something that's bigger than you actually have the money to do. And then what you come up with is creative ways to turn that disadvantage into an advantage. So there's so many things in Hard Home. The year before it was the same thing. In this one, one of the reasons that we decided to have the Wall of Shields that arises was because we didn't really have the money to see what was behind the Wall of Shields, because we would have had to stage all the fighting and dead bodies, etc., etc. We just didn't have the money to do it. Even when we were doing the body pile, we had 257 bodies, and that doesn't quite cover the body pile. So between setups, 10 people in the art department would basically run and move all the bodies to another place, and then move bodies to another place. And it was all about trying to cover this big pile of chicken wire that we didn't have the money to cover.
Well, I saw that you're not on the list for directors this year, but we can expect you back next year?
I would very much hope so, yes.